very much, Sergey, and thanks everyone for coming so early on a Monday morning. It only made sense when Sergey contacted me about coming here that I collaborate on this presentation with my colleague, and that seemed to make sense. So what we've done is, with an emphasis on practical, come up with a few, we hope, practical things that you might be able to do on different projects to really embed and work more productively between experience design specifically and content design. So first, some introductions here. And we'll have to do it this way. So this is my colleague Rosina, who is an experience designer at TFL. She's also a digital designer and a graphic designer. Now there's a misconception that some of you will know of and probably have heard about experience designers, something that Rosina really doesn't like to hear. Let's see if we can get this working. Nope, I think you're going to have to be the flipper here. Oh. Just make it look pretty. So we each have our own phrases that we don't like very much. I see a few nods in the audience. I think you've had this thrown at you once or twice.
Thanks, Felice. This is Felice Hawley. She's a content designer and strategist. She's also a digital skills trainer and former broadcast journalist. Very impressive lady. And equally, there's things that content designers don't like to hear, and one of Felice's just put some words to it. And I think, as we all know, there's a little bit more to content design than just putting words to a thing.
Okay, so a little bit about our teams. I currently sit as a member of the digital comms team. We are a team of content designers who work on the website and on blogs. And in our team also we have email editors and social media managers. Rosina sits in TFL Digital, and there you have about 25 members of your team, which includes experienced designers and researchers, product managers, analytics, and also we have quite a few people who deal with third-party partnerships. So before we go, I just wanted to get an idea of how many people in here, so it's that show of hands time, how many of you are actually content designers, or an equivalent job title, perhaps digital copywriter, web editor, something like that. So we have a few. Thank you, Sue. We have our support team here, Sue, who is a content designer at TFL. How many of the rest of you work directly with content designers? So not everyone. I wasn't sure what the proportion would be. But some of you do work content designers. I imagine some of you work maybe on a daily basis. Some of you work from time to time. So this is taken from the job description of a content designer at TFL. Not that unusual compared to several other job descriptions. What is a content designer? We are editorially based, so we design with primarily words, also images, graphics, icons, but we know how to arrange words on a page so that a scanning user can come and see the text that they need to see, if that's what they need to read. We adjust for tone of voice. We are skilled at creating plain English and negotiating with colleagues on how to write plain English. Something else you may not appreciate about content designers in many settings is we also tend to know the content management system better than anyone else because we have our hands in it every day. We're using it, we know its limitations, we know what it can do. Sometimes we even understand it better than the devs who will be looking at it from a developer portal, some sort of developer system, and yet we're the ones who actually have our hands in it every day. Another thing, I'm not sure about the content designers who are in the room, but most of the content designers I know and I work with, and I'm a contractor at TFL or a supplier, so I do work in other places as a content designer. Most of the content designers I know have a journalism background. came either trained as a journalist or their first jobs were somehow in journalism. And we may talk a little bit later about why that's significant. But we tend to have that sort of inquisitive mind. We also understand leaps in logic, how, when something is on a page, does it make sense? Is the story complete?
Just to add to that, what we're seeing over time is that between experience designers and content designers, they're being expected to know a little bit more about each other's skill sets. So we're seeing content designers being expected to know about things like prototyping, wireframes, all those kind of typical UX activities. And on the other side, we're also seeing UX designers being expected to know about things like microcopy, language, tone of voice, and we'll touch on a little bit about that later. But I think we can all agree that where we meet in the middle is the focus on users and that user-centered approach to design. User-centered design, after all, it includes the words, essentially.
Yay.
Yay, our clicker works, hooray. So I want to talk a little bit about the project that Felice and I came together and collaborated on. And that project was the launch of the Ultra Low Emission Zone in central London. And just for a bit of background around that, that is a driving scheme in central London on top of the existing congestion charge thing that's been operating for several years in the city. And this particular scheme is focused on the most polluting vehicles in the centre of London. It was really brought in to look at the air quality issue. And for us, it meant that there were a number of design challenges that it threw up. One of the most obvious being making sure that customers, people who drive, were aware of the incoming scheme and what it meant for them. It was potentially people who'd never had to pay to drive through London before, potentially expected to actually pay money for travelling through the zone. So that was a really big part of the project. Equally, that's the awareness thing. Equally, there was the actual mechanism of paying for the scheme itself. The existing journeys were very much set up for sort of single scheme stuff. They weren't really going to scale to support this coming in as well. So we kind of had to rebuild the payment UX from the ground up. And there was also, on top of that, this idea of the scheme being all about air quality and making sure that message was being communicated in the experience. At the exact same time that this is happening, that we're sort of getting on board with this project, due to a sort of organizational switcheroo at TFL, Felice and I found our teams newly put into different buildings and different parts of the organization. So when we came together onto this work, we had to really consciously think about the ways in which we worked together and almost rebuild our ways of working between our respective teams.
So we have 7 practical tips for you to consider, some of which will apply to the way you work, some of which may not, but we hope that some of you will at least take away a couple of things, very simple, very pragmatic tips. And the first one is bring content designers in as early as you can. I wouldn't say I was an afterthought, but there have been many times when I felt like I was a bit of an afterthought on a project like this. Brought in at the very end, sometimes long after the designers were done, sometimes after the dev work was gone. In this little compartment at the end was the content design work. So our recommendation is bring them in as early as you can, even if it's a consulting role, even if they attend 1 or 2 planning meetings, get involved in creating the user stories. Some communication needs to start as early as possible, even if their bulk of their work makes sense to be done later on. Now, I know for those of you who work through an agency, because I myself work through an agency for a lot of my work, will find this not in your control. Because the client doesn't want to pay for a content designer until the very end. They see it as sort of a final cost. It's right at the end. I get that. I mean, I understand why that happens. But if you, as the user experience lead on this or have any influence on this project, start asking, when is the content designer going to be brought in? What can they say? Can we bring them in? Can we at least talk to them on the phone? Who is it going to be? Any small steps you can do to incorporate the idea that the content needs to come in as early as possible, because the result is you will build a more robust process if you co-design it. Even the developers can use the content designer who knows this. If it's an existing CMS, there were many times where if I had been brought in earlier, I could have stopped work that was wasted because it was not possible. It wasn't possible in the way we worked. And this was sort of a small example. Somebody decided we were going to do all this on wireframes, which any of the content designers in the room will know just really doesn't work when you're working with content. You want to be in the actual application, see what it's going to look like. And this was a step that took a lot of time that didn't pan out really terribly well. In case you forget, we thought we'd say it one more time and just emphasize the point. We do think this is #1 step you have to take.
Thanks, Felice. So our second point is about getting your content designer on board with the project when they do actually join it. And we couldn't come up here as a transport authority and talk about onboarding without a picture of someone getting on a bus. So I hope you all appreciate that. But yeah, seriously, we really want to emphasize the importance of getting your content designer on board with your people, the processes, and the intent of your design, making sure you're sort of both, singing from the same hymn sheet, if you like, and making sure that they understand what story you're trying to tell with the experience that you're working on. For us, as I already mentioned, it was all about the air quality, the awareness, the reassurance of knowing what our customers had to do for this new scheme. And it's definitely time well spent, and doesn't have to be super formal with an agenda and everyone in the room doing your intros and stuff, but just as long as you're bringing them into the fold, I think you'll be all right. And added to that, the tools and the tools essentially that you're using, make sure that they have access to them and understand how it works. I mean, it sounds really, really simple, but even things like being able to input content into things like prototypes can go a long way into getting them involved in the project. And also communication tools. Something that we found when we worked together is that when Felice joined the project, I dutifully sent her an invite to our Slack channel where we were organising a lot of work. And after a few messages to Felice and not really getting a response, I sort of turned up at her desk like, "Are you okay?" And it turned out that because of the way that her laptop was set up to work with the TFL bits and pieces, she wasn't actually able to download the Slack app and was using it in browser where none of the notifications were coming through. So it was just a really sort of tiny thing that I hadn't appreciated. So just as an example.
Okay, great. So involve them in user research. This is what content designers should be doing. The role of content design as it's been really pioneered by GDS and by HMRC very explicitly states that the content designers should be involved in the user research. GDS content designers are expected to take part in user research, or certainly be observing user testing. I think they have to do it at least a couple of times a month or every couple of months. So it's formally in there. But I know that in other job descriptions, it's not quite as formal. And I won't say TFL was any more guilty than other people, but I felt sometimes like if I were invited to take part in user research or particularly user testing, it was almost like it was extra. It was a privilege and not, this was a really good idea and I should have been doing this all along. It was almost like a last minute thought. Oh, Felice, would you like to come along to listen to the results of user testing? And the reason you want to get content designers in early into this process is that we do tend to hear different things than the experienced designer, especially for something that was a process-led project. I was listening to the words. I was almost listening to the tone of voice. I was listening to the language that our potential users were using. It also helped to build a team spirit. We understood where the users were better together. The other thing about, particularly in this project, was that I was working with teams from City Hall on the awareness of air quality, the mayor's air quality message. This was something that the content designers were more responsible for than the experienced designers. So if I hadn't been in the room, sort of the questions and issues around the air quality were not necessarily being picked up by the rest of the team. So bring your them into user research. If you can't get them into testing and actually doing the user research, get them to work on the report with you if you're writing a user research report. If that's not possible because they've been isolated towards the end, make sure they get something readable. The number of times I've been said, oh yeah, here's all the research over here in this huge, massive research that I don't have time at that point to really consume. So do give some thought about making sure your content designer has access to that user research. This was a tool, the other way, Rosina was talking about getting us access to the, for instance, prototyping. There would have been a lot of time would have been saved if I'd had access to some of the prototyping tools that they were using. The reverse is true, also to get the experienced designers to have access to one of our primary tools, which in this case was the TFL Style Guide. Again, sorry to be a show of hands thing, but how many of you are working for an organization that has a strong editorial style guide and working from it? Okay, fair number. Some of you may have a style guide, but nobody knows actually where it is. It's parked in a file somewhere. It doesn't get updated. Ours at TFL is pretty vigorous, and there's a team that actively keeps it up to date. And there were a few things that happened early in the process before I joined, either by the devs or even by the experienced designers. They were using a particular language, or even things like spelling and styles with capital letters and all those little style issues that were not done to the TFL Style Guide. So I came along like a bad fairy and said, nope, can't do that, nope, can't do that. And it would have saved a lot of time if we hadn't had to go through that stage. It also set up for some stakeholders, including City Hall, a little bit of an expectation about what would be on the page. And then I came along and kind of spoiled it by saying, that's not in our style, we don't do that. On the other hand, you might want to be very conscious of building your own style guide for a particular project. So there were a few things we did on this project, really tiny things. I know it might be difficult to see, but you'll see there's a numeral 9 in that first sentence there. In the TFL Style Guide, like a lot of style guides, we spell out the full word 0 to 9. We use the word instead of the numeral. But in some, not particularly in this page, but on some of our processes, in the whole congestion charge and ULEZ processes, we said this was more scannable, it made more sense. We created a rule, put it in our own little project style guide, and communicated it to other people. Another bit of style that we had a lot of fun with was something as simple, whoops, I'm going to fall off the stage.
Oh my God, Felice.
Drama, yay. 3 of 5. something as simple as this. We had every single developer on the project did this a different way. So we had 3/5 with no spaces, 3 of 5, 3 of 5 with words, 3 of 3 and 5. It's a simple, small thing, but we literally had, I think, 5 or 6 different versions of this on the, 70-odd processes that we're going through. So again, we created a little pattern library for ourselves.
Thanks, Felice. So our 5th point is about feedback and when you're reaching out to stakeholders to get feedback on your work. And obviously, in an ideal world, you and your content designer will be co-creating the work together and asking for feedback on it together as one kind of unit. But say your content designer is still working on some of the language in a user journey, but you want to get an early steer from your stakeholder on you want their feedback, essentially. In that situation, and we learned this the hard way, make sure that you're really clear on what you're asking for feedback on. So if the content in your design is draft and work in progress, be really explicit about that. And I say we learned this the hard way, sort of unbeknownst to us, some of our work ended up at City Hall, where they were sort of agonizing over the particular word choice that we'd used in one of our user journeys, and the whole thing was written in a kind of draft text, and they just hadn't appreciated that because we hadn't been explicit enough about what state the journey was in, if that makes sense. Yeah. Our next point, and really what all these points kind of boil down to, is becoming your own kind of mini team. You've got more power over decisions and being able to own the process when you're able to kind of come together and work on it as kind of mini team. And you can also advocate for each other. For those of you who do work with content designers, I wonder how many times you've been in a meeting or where content is being discussed and your content designer isn't actually present. And this happened a couple of times with us, and we kind of developed this kind of where's Felice rule. So if I'm in a meeting, I'm like, is Felice coming to this meeting? And it's just those simple steps of ensuring that the rest of the people that you're working with are kind of really aware that content design is a really key part of the experience and needs to be treated that way. An example of how this mini team of Felice and I worked in action is, you can see on the left, this term vehicle registration mark, where when we inherited a lot of the driving user journeys that we needed to work on, this term was everywhere, and we knew it wasn't a user-facing term. We knew that users were having a lot of trouble with it, and it appears at the start of a lot of journeys, so it was kind of like almost at the first hurdle, they're like, oh, what's that? Not where you want to be. So Felice had separate conversations with our stakeholder. I had separate conversations with our stakeholder, and each time we got pushback. I mean, there's legitimate reasons around why they wanted that term in there, and which I'm not going to go into. But the point is, it was only when we realized that we both had the same problem almost, and we came together and we pooled our resources and we drew from all the user research and presented that as a single kind of idea to the stakeholder that we actually got some change done, and the word number plate got inserted in at the front end of that field.
Contain your excitement.
Contain your excitement, people. Contain your excitement. And yeah, you're kind of laughing here. It doesn't seem like the biggest kind of, whoa, victory moment, but for us at the time, it was a significant kind of yay moment and the result of literally months of effort. So mini team is a go.
To sort of bookend our first point about bringing the content designer in as early as possible is the final bit, which is to leave UX on the project as long as possible. And again, I understand that for many of you, this is not in your control, but where you can, think about extending that. Now, of course, in an agency, often I've come on and, as I said, UX is gone, their work is done, no more to be seen. I didn't have access. Their hours were no longer billable to the project. In fact, Rosina had officially been moved on to other things in the last, month or two before we went live. I was lucky I was still able to get her ear and her eye every once in a while. But on other projects I've worked on, I really wanted to have that team member with me, somebody that I could go to and try things out on and just run things past. And too often they were, like I said, already moved off on another project. Their hours were not their own. I didn't have access to them anymore. So where you can think about extending, even if it's only in a sort of small consulting role, the experienced designer's presence on the project after they maybe officially have been moved off. So the result was after a very intense period of work, we launched the Ultra Low Emission Zone on the 8th of April, 2019. It actually worked. We had 300,000 customers using one of the tools new tools that were created, which was the vehicle checker, where you can come and see if your vehicle meets the emission standards of the Ultra Low Emission Zone. So that was the first day, was 300,000. I think we've had 2.5 million customers in the first 3 months. Somebody just sent me a number from the press office, which I don't remember right now, but basically the number of the most polluting vehicles that ULEZ was aimed at, the number of them entering central London in the first 6 months, I believe, dropped by 38% once the Ultra Low Emission Zone was started. Now, we don't take credit for all of that, but we do take credit for some of it working as smoothly as it did. So, thank you very much. And are there any questions?